the conservatory of the Dolly Sisters Cultural Preservation Society.
Yes, but for starters, let's start at...
Hang on, darling, your teeth, darling. Yes, just...
There we go. That's much better, thank you. Then let's start on ceremonies. Now, these are in themselves superficial things.
Yes.
Yet,
True, very true.
Yes. A man of the world should know them. Yes?
Every man.
Yes. You see, they are the outworks of manners and decency, which would be too often broken in upon if it were not for that defense which keeps the enemy at a proper distance.
Yes.
Proper distance.
Good fences make good names.
Yes.
Better names.
Yes, at a proper distance.
Yes.
Fence. What? Yes. You see, it is for that. What?
Arm's length, the proper distance.
Yes. Between what?
Anything really.
A man and his fence.
A man and his fence.
Oh, yes.
And his neighbour's fence.
I think I read that book.
Yes.
Really?
Yes, it's good. I think so.
The man behind the fence?
Yes, the man with the fence.
The Watchmaker by Your Nomad Soul. The watchmaker sat at his desk, working. It had just gone 4 in the morning and he was almost finished. His old eyes ached with tiredness and burned from concentration while his aged but practiced hands shook ever so slightly as they went about their business. It was extremely delicate work, and dangerous for that matter. Each component of the device had been designed and calibrated with almost unimaginable intricacy, accurate to the nanometer. There was no room for any fault or loose part, not when so much was at stake. The watchmaker's brow furrowed as he looked through the microscope at the small, toothed wheel he was placing. He almost laughed at the thought that such a devastatingly intricate and advanced device still made use of this age-old machine. But it did, because it had to. No amount of silicone could replicate the most basic function of a cog, no matter how these newfangled techies argued it. The piece was placed, and the watchmaker moved on to the next piece. It was even smaller than the cog, but infinitely more important. It looked, for all intents and purposes, like a fine electric blue thread, no thicker than a hair. One might even say that it had the appearance of an arc of electricity that had somehow been confined to physical form, or, more simply, a microscopic version of Zeus's lightning bolt. The watchmaker placed it in a small notch on the device, beside 6 others just like it. The machine was almost complete. All that remained were 3 tiny diamonds, so small that each had almost as few atoms as humans have years, give or take a few 100,000. They were to be placed in a set of chambers that formed a triangle around the inner workings of the device. The watchmaker felt a ball of excitement, tension, and traces of gas in his stomach. This was it. Almost. The watchmaker, Lars Gleistengruber, had spent the better part of his life, which was now approaching a length of almost 80 years, envisioning and designing this little trinket on which so much hung in the balance. He was a tall, lanky fellow, now stooped with age. His once dark hair was now completely white, except where it no longer existed on his shiny, bald crown. He kept it short because it got in the way of his work, and so did facial hair, so naturally he was clean-shaven. His sunken eyes were so dark that they seemed black, and when coupled with the deep lines and folds of skin that riddled his face, they gave the impression that he was always miles away. However, years of working with tiny tools at ridiculous magnifications had blessed him with such poor eyesight that he had to wear a pair of spectacles so thick that he looked, for all the world, like a bad-tempered, 80-year-old Powerpuff Girl. The green one. He placed the diamonds in their respective chambers and sealed them. There was one thing left to do. He rummaged around in the drawers under his workbench until he found what he was looking for. He picked the device up gently and slowly clipped it into its casing. Finally, he screwed the back cover into place before placing the little object on the workbench, where he stared at it, exhausted and satisfied, for some time. He stood up and went to the liquor cabinet that stood in the corner near the back of his office. He pulled out a crystal tumbler and a bottle of Johnny Blue and proceeded to pour himself a double. After a swig, or two, well, 3 for good measure, he walked over to the antique phone that was mounted on his wall. He dialed slowly, even by the standards of those annoying telephones that one dials by rotating a disc with holes to slot one's fingers in. He could handle quantum mechanics no problem, but too many buttons just confused him. He waited a moment or two before the man on the other end of the receiver picked up. "Hello, George?" said Lars. His voice was curt, but it had a gravelly character that hinted at years behind a cigarette. "Lars?" responded a soft, tired voice from the other end. "What in blue blazes are you doing ringing me up at this godforsaken hour? Are you deranged?" "George," said Lars urgently, "you must come quick. I've done it." "Done what?" asked George. He sounded worried. "Something amazing," trembled Lars. He could barely contain his excitement. "Oh, no," said George. "What is it this time? Is Jill okay?" Jill was Lars's wife, and she was perfectly fine, although she hadn't been speaking to Lars for the past week. Granted, Lars hadn't spoken to her in almost 2 weeks, not since he discovered how to make the resonators actually do what they were supposed to do. Since then, he had holed himself up in his office, working tirelessly up to this point. This crucial point. Nothing would be the same from today. Lars was sure of that. "Jill's fine," said Lars. "Just get here as fast as you can. You have to see it." George's mind was racing as the taxi drove him to the jeweler on the corner of 51st and 7th, where Lars worked as a watchmaker and repairman. He was worried that Lars had finally overestimated the curious balance of stupidity, ingenuity, and downright luck that had saved his neck more times than George could remember. Even when he and Lars had served together in the war 60 years before, he noticed that Lars would often rush into a fray head first without a helmet, and yet emerge somehow alive to tell the tale, and get the medal. George wasn't like that. He was a short, jumpy man with a face and demeanor that likened itself to a squirrel when he was in a good mood, and a rat when he wasn't. He was 3 years younger than Lars, but found that he always felt older. He said that Lars was childish. Lars said that he was anal retentive. After the war, George was glad to see Lars settle down with Jill, even if being a watchmaker was an odd choice of profession for him. But, to George's horror, Lars developed a fascination with quantum physics and began to fancy himself an inventor. On one occasion, Lars had built a contraption which he claimed was a working quantum computer. It looked like a small cube about the size of a die, which glowed electric blue and hovered in the center of a large metal ring which was connected to the wall socket and to a large screen. The computer worked, at first. It seemed to intuitively understand all that Lars was telling it verbally to do. But in true Lars fashion, he hadn't quite thought the darn contraption through. The method he was using to stabilize each qubit in its various states quickly overloaded the power source, blacking out everything in a 5-block radius. When the power failed, so did the stabilizing mechanism, causing an explosion that somehow managed to destroy every piece of glass and electronic equipment in the building, but left Lars and George unscathed. Jill almost divorced him after that, and so Lars stopped working on anything for almost 20 years. Or so George thought. Evidently not, thought George, or he wouldn't be on his way to Lars's office at 4:20 in the morning. The cab stopped. George tumbled out of the car and into the shop. "What is it, Lars?" he panted. What have you done?" "Have a whiskey," said Lars, offering him a glass. You brought me here at 5 in the damn morning for whiskey? You've gone senile, my old friend. No doubt." "Don't be ridiculous, George," laughed Lars. "I haven't gone senile. The Viagra works just fine." Senile, not sterile, you asshole, growled George. He hadn't gotten over his morning grumpiness enough to find Lars funny. What do you want me to see? Whiskey first, old boy, said Lars, and then we can play. George grumbled all the way through the first sip, and then, upon realizing exactly what whiskey it was, he fell silent and stared at his old friend. Good, huh? Smiled Lars. Yes, said George, looking at his glass. But you've either done something really amazing or really stupid to open this up. Hopefully the former, but probably the latter. Maybe both. What is it, Lars? What have you done? If it's another damn computer, I'll smash it with my bare hands before I let you turn it on, you hear? Lars simply laughed. Follow me. Lars led George into the back office where he worked and pointed to a small silver pocket watch lying on the workbench. It seemed for all the world to be perfectly ordinary, save for two differences. First, instead of a single adjustment dial, it had two. Second, the face consisted of 4 separate clock faces, a large one with slender Victorian hands which simply told the time, and 3 smaller ones like the kind you find on sports watches. It was certainly more elegant than Lars's other contraptions, thought George, but he still didn't trust the thing. Knowing Lars, this thing could probably do more damage than Fat Man or Little Boy could dream of. There it is, said Lars. My magnificent octopus. Your what? My magnum opus, said Lars. My life's work. Drink, Johnny, why don't you? He can make you laugh any time. And what is it? Asked George, taking a sip. I call it a wobbler. What? A wobbler. And what does it do? Well, sighed Lars, it wobbles. George was incredulous. Viagra or not, this man had fallen off his rocking chair somewhere over the Mariana Trench. You're serious? Well, at the most basic level, said Lars, that's all it does. You're no fun in the morning, you know. I spent all night thinking of those jokes. It's actually a spatio-temporal resonator. I call it the Silver Star for short. And what does it do? Well, I'm not quite sure. Meaning? George felt a shiver of apprehension. Lars was doing what he did best, breaking the laws of nature and forgetting the one law that mattered, Murphy's. Lars always said that Murphy was an idiot dipstick who was mad at the world because he never got a date. Murphy didn't like that, so there was a mutual hatred between the law and the man. It's calibrated to detect and vibrate at the resonant frequency of the space-time continuum, creating a localized disturbance of constructive interference. Disturb the space-time continuum, said George. Are you mad? It's only a localized disturbance, argued Lars, in theory. And what would it achieve, Well, I'm not sure about that either. Theoretically, if the frequencies are altered correctly, one could move through either space or time without disturbing the other. So, it's a teleporter and a time machine, surmised George. No. Yes. Maybe. I don't know, actually, said Lars. All it really does is vibrate at very specific, constantly changing frequencies. If they change all the time, how do you match them? That's the tricky part, said Lars. Because the continuum is tangible, it has resonant frequencies, but it has no mass. Why? Good question, I'm glad you asked. Simply put, the resonant frequencies of empty space are wherever the resonant frequencies of matter are not. By matter, I mean matter and antimatter, just so we're clear. The look on George's face signaled that clarity was a long-forgotten concept at this point. Lars continued, oblivious to his old friend's quandary. Time poses a greater challenge, though.
since we only really know what it is because we experience it as a constant progression from one state to the other, usually as decay, which is brought about by the transfer of energy. Therefore, the presence and transfer of energy indicates the flow of time, and the total absence of energy shows us where we can find the resonant frequencies of time.
George caught himself drooling slightly. Lars made a mental note of this, but chose to press on.
If we cross-reference these two sets of frequencies, we find the nodal points of the space-time continuum, which are infinite in a universe as vast as ours. The frequencies found at these nodal points are the base frequencies of the space-time continuum.
Lars took a sip of whiskey and a breath, and then carried on talking.
In the star, there are 7 quantum string resonators. What they do is cycle through multiple states of quanta at a specific frequency until they match a base frequency for a nanosecond, in which time they ping it, raising a single crest or lowering a single trough and causing a tiny disturbance. Then, the QSR cycles backward at a new frequency until the same thing happens again. The QSR ping-pongs through the frequencies, and each disturbance brings the spectrum closer together until a single frequency is reached. When that happens, the space-time continuum at that specific point in space and time becomes rigid instead of being in flux, and a disparate anomaly is created in which the resonant frequency of the continuum begins to follow the QSR as opposed to the other way around. The star contains 7 QSRs, and when each of the 7 reaches a single frequency, the device and the area around it is removed from the natural flux of the space-time continuum and is able to move through it, free of its constraints, simply by altering the frequencies of the QSRs.
Lars finished his whiskey in a single gulp. George followed suit, almost, it seemed, unaware of what he was doing. Lars promptly poured them each another of the old 2-fingered salute.
That's the theory, at least, he said as he poured. Does it make sense? Gosh, I feel like a scientist.
And what happens then? Asked George, absent-mindedly taking the tumbler Lars held out to him. He wasn't sure he liked the idea of fiddling with the fabric of the universe. She was a fragile lady, and would certainly not like her prized dress being altered without her consent.
I'm not sure about that, said Lars thoughtfully. The disturbance could have a ripple effect and unwrap the universe, or the device and the area around it could cease to exist altogether, or, very possibly, nothing could happen at all. That's the exciting bit.
Exciting is not the way I would put it.
Of course, the star could do exactly what I wanted to, and the world would change forever.
I think the world would change regardless. How long do the string thingies take to finish their ping-pong thing?
Oh, anywhere from a millisecond to an epoch, said Lars. I have no way to be sure.
And what's to say the thing doesn't get lost in time or something? Land up on some caveman's doorstep and change the world as we know it?
It might, laughed Lars. But I put it into a clock for a reason. You see, the mechanical ticking serves as a reference point, keeping it attached to a singular forward-backward motion of time. Hopefully.
Toss it, said George. There's far too much that could go wrong.
Not on your life, laughed Lars. I've worked for years on this thing, and today is the day I'll test it.
And with that, he put his whiskey down and picked the pocket watch up. He popped the 2 dials up and began adjusting them. When he had finished, he clicked the dials back and put it back on the workbench. The 2 of them watched closely. George with the nervous energy of a man standing in front of a hungry bear, and Lars with the anticipation of a child at a magic show. After a few seconds, the watch glowed bright blue for a moment, and then returned to its original state. Lars's eyes widened.
The frequencies have become fixed.
They watched it for 5 more minutes. Nothing happened.
Oh, come on!
Shouted Lars, throwing a glass full of top-notch whiskey at the watch. The tumbler somehow managed to fly through the watch and into the table before shooting out back at Lars. Thankfully, the tumbler's aim was slightly off, and it promptly exploded against the wall behind the two thoroughly surprised men.
What the hell?
Breathed George. The universe wasn't happy. He knew it.
I think, said Lars after a moment, that it's vibrating through space-time. The workbench is vibrating too. I gave it no direction to move in, so it's simply maintaining the disturbance. It's everywhere, nowhere, and somewhere, all the time. The only thing keeping it here is the ticking of the watch. Look.
He took a silver pen and held it over the workbench before dropping it. The pen fell into the workbench and promptly flew out straight into the ceiling, somehow driving the point far enough in to hold it there. George let out a little yelp. Lars laughed.
Curious, he said. It seems that it's alternating between here and wherever else it is, trillions of times a second. Ha!
How do you stop it from doing that? Said George. You can't touch it without flying off.
I hadn't actually thought of that.
You hadn't thought of that, yelled George. You created a machine that could be unwrapping the universe as we speak, and you hadn't thought of how to turn it off?
Whoa, George. Take it easy, huh? I can turn it off if I can reach it, okay? I just don't know how to do that. And in case you haven't noticed, the universe is perfectly fine right now.
Well, I'm not, said George, still agitated. Find a way to reach it, and fast.
Okay, relented Lars. Just give me a moment to think.
Lars stood staring at the watch for some time, while George began to pace the room nervously, shooting glances at Lars and the small silver trinket that was on the verge of giving him another stroke.
I might just have it,
said Lars eventually. What?
Well, we can't touch it because of the vibrations, answered Lars. But the workbench is vibrating with it.
So,
the workbench picked up the vibrations from it. Now, if it can do that, then so can I.
How, Lars? How do you plan to pick up the vibrations?
Like this,
said Lars, slowly reaching over to the watch. He held his hand barely a millimeter over the watch for a while, until he closed his fingers around its smooth silver surface and picked it up.
There we are,
he said, as if it had been the easiest exercise in the world. Well, said George,
switch it off.
Lars laughed. There was a glint in his eye that George hadn't seen in years.
Not yet, said Lars. Let's see if we can move around, shall we?
Lars turned one of the dials and promptly disappeared.
Lars!
Screamed George. He looked around the office wildly. What was he going to tell Jill? That he had let her idiot of a husband wipe himself off the face of the earth? To hell with that.
In here, George,
called Lars from the store's lobby.
It works fine, perfectly fine.
Jesus, Lars, said a relieved George as he entered the store lobby. You nearly killed me.
Well, then this should put you over the edge,
laughed Lars.
It's time to move through time.
No, Lars, don't, shouted George, but it was too late. Lars had again adjusted the dials.
I think, he said, smiling, sometime in April 1956, around my second birthday. I've always wished I could watch Elvis live and in his prime. I'll be back for breakfast, I promise.
You're a fool, Lars, said George. A genius, but a fool. Lars clicked the dials down. The hands of the watch began to spin backwards. George watched in horror as the clothes that Lars was wearing turned into tufts of cotton and blobs of very strange grey goo before disappearing altogether. His shoes and belt became pieces of cowhide before they too vanished. Lars himself grew younger before George's eyes until a small 2-year-old infant sat where he once stood, staring up at George. The watch, too, was victim to this reversal of the natural order. Beside the baby lay a small pile of rocks and sand and 3 microscopic diamonds. Well, Lars, said George to the baby, would you mind telling me how I am ever gonna explain this to your wife? Meanwhile, in the conservatory of the Dolly Sisters Cultural Preservation Society.
Let's press on, shall we?
Yes.
So, books on etiquette are useful in as much as they expound the laws of polite society.
Yes.
Yes. Experience. Oh, wait, just hold on a second. Let's see what they've done.
Lovely tea, this Beatrice.
Yes. Coffee. Experience alone, however, can give effect to the precise manner in which those laws are required to be observed. One, the choice of friends. Now here.
Yes,
Yes.
a man is only as good as friends. What
Yes.
he gives the company that he
Yes.
gives us is very good
Very-
reflection.
Yes,
of man's
yes.
character.
At arm's length, of course.
Yes.
Proper.
And with
proper
face.
Face.
Yes.
Between,
Face,
yes.
yes.